Oh, not that one. Here we go. We're dropping our intro. There we go. It's so frantic there, isn't it? It's so frenetic, I think. Welcome to the Palmer and Holsclaw show, where we are bridging faith and life by getting below the headlines and beyond the party lines. At some point, we're actually going to talk about what that means. So we're still going to do all the intro things sometime in the future, but we're finishing off our politics of Pentecost. Sean, what have we been talking about these last couple days?
A little bit of everything. So we started out on Monday with the day after Pentecost Sunday, just walking through what does this mean, this day where we talk about, the flaming tongues and the church, the launching of the church, and you've got a church that is united. Everyone there in Acts can hear the gospel in their own language. But at the same time, we are living in the shadow of George Floyd and the protest demonstrations and riots. And so we've been talking this week about what that means for the church, what it means for Christian people. So then we talk about like the politics of Jesus a little bit. I think we're going to get more into that today. But overall, looking at how do Christian people faithfully witness in an era, in a time where that seems like the last lever that folks want to pull. I remember Wednesday we were talking about creation and new creation and what it looks like or what it feels like or what we can assume from scripture that God is up to in the world. So for a week where we were just getting launched and gonna do some get to know you lighthearted kind of stuff, man, it's been a doozy.
Yeah. And thank you to all of you who are watching live online as we stream. Feel free to jump in on the comments. Except for Sean doesn't read them, but I need them because I'm insecure. So that's how it rolls. But also share this, whether you're watching it live or not. Please share this on your timelines and other places. But today we're talking, I proposed. I was like, hey, we need to talk about riots. Are riots the way of Jesus? I have a lot of people on my timelines who are going both directions, getting totally consumed by feeling the need to condemn rioting. Others who are like justifying them, and then especially in my timelines, like white people don't have any room to judge what is going on. So people are polarizing, shocker, these days. So I wanted us to kind of talk about this. For me, I'll just kind of set up for me where this is kind of coming from, and then you can kind of jump in.
Sure.
Last week in my theology and culture class at Northern Seminary, shout out to Northern Seminary, we were talking about race. This is just the week that it fell onto. And so, the murder of George Floyd and all these other things were kind of our big topic. And we were talking about how kind of the story of the creation of modern racism in the West, how it was used to justify slavery and all these other things. We were talking about white privilege, what that means for us, how people like myself have benefited from this system. But then just yesterday, we switched topics to talk about war and Christian justifications of war, or Christian criticisms of war and violence, and whether there was any place for violence in faith. And I think for me, riots are kind of like the perfect intersection of what does it mean for race, racism, privilege, and how do you understand riots? And then what does it mean as a Christian to ask the question, is violence ever justified? Is it ever part of the way of Jesus? And so these things are really intersecting for me. As a white man, I don't necessarily want to condemn riots because I just want to listen. As a Christian, I want to say I'm pretty sure that is not the way of Jesus. So that's kind of what I'm bringing myself personally, as well as the conversations I'm hearing. But what do you bring to this conversation as we just launch in?
Well, I think that's really great. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall in your classes as you were talking about that move from race to riots. And here's what I find really fascinating about that conversation is not that riots happen, but how we carry riots and what we define as a riot, right? There are some places where I think most people would say that's clearly a riot. People are smashing windows, breaking into cars. There are folks looting stores. That's clearly a riot. But then on the other hand, you get, I was watching videos this morning of places that were pretty peaceful, and someone from multiple sides, like some protesters, sometimes it's the law enforcement there. They were the ones who instigated the violence. And then there were a little flash of violence. And there are some folks who, I'm not saying it's legitimate or not, who would call that a riot. So my friend Jonathan Stormont several years ago wrote a book called How to Start a Riot.
Oh, wow.
And yeah. So, but it was a walk through the book of Acts, right? Because what happens in almost every place the disciples go, right? Almost every place the disciples go, there is something that someone might call a riot. And whenever there is, it's the claiming of, hey, you guys did something I don't like, and then there was some sort of vandalism or violence attached, no matter what the percentage was of people who caused it. Like the riot itself serves as a philosophical scaffolding to dismiss whatever the writing was about, even if it's about violence, which is an interesting move, I think, philosophically to make. Mm-hmm. So when someone kills someone and is found guilty, and the states that perform capital punishment then in turn kill that person, the violence that the person started is the reason that they had violence visited upon them, and we call that justice. But if someone suffers an injustice violently, and there is violence in return for the violence that they caused, it's called rioting, right? So we have this interesting relationship with rioting and violence, because we call it whatever we want to call it based on what we believe to be the just thing to have happened. Mm. So it's not, I don't think, at least, it doesn't appear to me purely like one-to-one. It's at least complicated. And I think that's why the spiritual move, the Christian move, has always been one of nonviolence, because as King said, like violence begets violence. And that's one of the remarkable things about the crucifixion of Jesus, I think, is that the disciples then don't turn to violence in response to the violence they have received. Does that make sense? Or on Jesus's behalf?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that leads us into the way of Jesus. And is it political? Because I know it's like, let's not talk all this politics and these types of things. And so this is kind of getting us to the way or the politics of Jesus. And so I want to like transition from there. So I want to get back to the question of rioting, because I have, people are now like, well, what about the Boston Tea Party, or what about the Boston Massacre? And then what about Jesus in the temple? And I'm actually going to talk about Jesus. I want us to talk about Jesus in the temple. So thank you all for joining in. I see a bunch of people watching and a couple people commenting. So thanks so much. So about the politics.
Well, Jeff, before you get that, I just want to be clear about this, because probably one of the things you don't know about me is that my father, for a lot of his years in education, was an American history teacher. And I am an armchair American historian. That's actually where I do most of my reading. And if you want to talk about the Boston Tea Party, I can talk about that all day.
Oh no! Well, we only scheduled this for a half hour, but maybe we need a bonus round.
Right.
So I'm going to do this new feature here because I can, and I'm having fun. So I'm going to hit this and say, Heather Drake just jumped in and commented on Facebook. Thank you for this conversation. I have Rick, who's actually a student at Northern. He says we were talking about the difference between retributive justice and the cycles of death, rather than the hope for the resurrection, things like that. So thank you all for jumping in, and I just wanted to have fun with those buttons. So there we go.
Yeah. And I've taken you off a field because I wanted to mention that about American history, because I get pretty psyched.
Yeah, no, that's really great. So So we're going to talk about just off the top of my head three things that are important about the way of Jesus. But I want to talk about just being called Christians.
Mm,
And what that means, because a lot of times we just think of it as um, being followers of Jesus or disciples. In Antioch, I had it written down here, but now I can't find it. Oh yeah, in Acts 11. 26, it says that in Antioch the disciples were first called Christians,
mm,
and how but a lot of times we don't understand what that means. So the suffix at the end, IAN, that is at the end of Christian, for Christ one, is actually a political term. It means followers. It means followers of a political figure. And so Greeks who were trying to understand who all these Jews were that were following Jesus, and they called them the anointed one, which is Christ in Greek. They were just like, well, he's like their legislator, their politician, and I guess they follow his teaching, so we're going to call them Christians. And so Christians at its core was a political term. And then even before that, they were called the followers of the way, or those who belong to a certain way.
mm,
And that's supposed to make us think of the Isaiah, calling in the wilderness, make straight the ways of the Lord. And Paul, or Saul, when he was persecuting the church, he asked for letters for the synagogues in Damascus so that he could find any belonging to the way. And so we want to talk about, what is this way that Saul found so threatening to his way of life, that was, as you said in the book of Acts, creating riots. So in future episodes, or a whole week theme, we'll probably talk about the politics of Jesus or the politics of the church. You think we
mm.
could do that? You think we could find anything to talk about on that?
There's probably a little bit there,
A little bit.
especially in our current context.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So
So
I mean, what's important about that for you? That it is that the nomenclature is political. Like,
that it's a way, that's something we practice, because especially in my kind of evangelical upbringing and background, we were kind of thought like, well, don't be political, or Jesus isn't political, or let's be spiritual, not political, or salvation is about individuals, and not about society. And since it's going to burn, we're going to get out of here. um and so for me, I need to kind of remind myself and remind people like me that, Jesus kind of like understood, not in the politics of right and left, but in the
mm,
politics. And this is why, our tagline is trying to get beyond the party lines, but that doesn't mean we're not talking about politics. And so that's,
mm,
for me, why I wanted to talk about it. So when we talk about things like riots, we're like, the politics of Jesus should be part of that, and the politics of Pentecost. So the first point that I wanted to bring with the politics of Pentecost is, Jesus understood himself as anointed by the Spirit.
mhm,
And that means in Luke 14, 18, and 19. And this is just a summary because I couldn't stick it all on the banner. But it means, so the actual text is, Jesus says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, and to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord." And so some people call this the Jesus Manifesto. And so this isn't
mm,
just a spiritual, a disembodied spiritual kind of understanding. This is very much an embodied, relational, even political
mhm,
kind of sense. And so Jesus lived out of the power of the spirits to do all sorts of things. And I think this, um, for for people like me, and we're going to kind of keep bringing it back to questions of rioting, but for people like me with a white evangelical kind of history and background, are the things I'm saying about riots, or even the death of George Floyd and others, or just racism in general, does it sound like good news to the poor? Is my first
right.
question. Is there even good news, or is it just condemnation, or is it just dismissal? Uh, is it, and two times freedom is mentioned. And so is freedom being explored or understood? And I think a lot of times, too often it's not the case for at least people from my background. And so
Right.
when I hear these things of anointed by the Spirit, I want to, and my friend and past co-pastor, Juliet Lou, she said, we really need to learn how to listen. We need to learn how to learn, and we need
Mhm,
to learn how to lament. And so we need to do these things. And so the Spirit of the anointed especially for people who are more privileged and outside these immediate kind of contexts, need to do those things. So that was the first thing, is that the way of Jesus is the way of the anointed spirit who's liberating the oppressed.
Yeah, there are a couple of things you said there I think are really important about that kind of followers of the way as a kind of political designation. So I want to try to tie a couple of threads together. I think that you mentioned that are really interesting. Like that happens only because of the historic Orthodox confession of faith that Jesus is Lord. Right. So, which is itself a political statement. Jesus is Lord, and those who follow him claim that
Caesar is not.
political. Exact. And neither is capitalism, neither is democracy itself. And like that's one of the things in America that is under our skin that we never talk about. What gives rise to the kind of partisanship isn't purely partisanship itself. It is the divination of democracy itself. That democracy itself is its own kind of good, an unquestioned good, unquestioned virtue. Are there great things about democracy? Obviously so, but that's something that we need to deal with. But I think what you heard both in your church and in what most folks hear in evangelical churches when they say that Jesus isn't political, what people meant when they told us that, I think in the most generous spirit, is that Jesus isn't partisan.
Yes.
Right? Except you and I are about the same age, and we could probably denote when in the last 20 to 30 years that really shifted. And what people mean when they say Jesus isn't political or now is that he's not on the opposite side of our politics now. Because what's happened is partisanship has become so entrenched in the American spirit that for Christians, the things that I believe genuinely are the things of God. And if you don't believe that, then you're being political. So like I'm on God's side or God's on my side, and everything else is on the other side. So I think you bring up a really important point. Jesus's understanding of himself as the anointed one, as the liberating king, who then those who follow him can have no other allegiance to any other political power. So I think that's huge what you mentioned there.
Yeah, when I think about these things and the partisanship, the political partisanship, I always just think of the angel of the Lord that confronts Joshua early on, when when the people are being led into the promised land, and he's like, "Hey, are you for us or are you for against us? And, are you on my side or not?" And he's like, "No, I am the commander of the Lord's army. So are you with me?" Is really the question.
Right.
And that's what I think. The saying that Jesus is Lord. I literally, and this was a week. This was 2 weeks ago, back when people were talking about states' rights and whether governors can be shutting down churches and all these types of things. And someone wrote on my timeline that the Constitution is king, and I was just like, no, Jesus is king. The last time people said we have no king but Caesar, they were killing the Messiah, right? And so it's
right.
like Christians should never be saying anything is king outside of Jesus. That should be our main kind of focus.
Right.
But we follow, and you kind of alluded this to before, is we follow King Jesus, who lays down his rights. This is the second point, or all the way unto death. He gives up his life. And so for me, a seminal, not just for me, right? And actually, I put this in wrong. This is not Ephesians. This is Philippians 2. But so this great hymn in Philippians 2 is speaking of Jesus, who in being the very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but rather he took on the form of a slave. And so he didn't take the rights, the privileges that were his by nature. And he didn't use those to his own advantage. And this is Paul kind of writing in his letter to Philippians. And he did the same thing for himself. He had these rights as a Roman citizen. He had rights as an apostle. And he said, I always lay these down to serve other people. And so the model that we have for Christians is not taking up our rights to get the things that we want, but it's to lay down our rights and to lay down our very lives in service non-violently for others. And so I think this, at least for me, when we come to an understanding of the politics of Jesus or the way of Jesus, is that we always lay down kind of our primary assumptions. Uh, I don't think it means we lay down our beliefs or things like that, but we lay down the things we grasp hold to.
Right.
And for someone like me who has a lot of privilege, and people like me, I think we need to kind of slow the roll of criticisms, slow the roll of finger pointing, and do what I mentioned before, is listening and learning and lamenting as that way of laying down rights. Now, this is where it gets sticky. Are you ready?
Yeah.
But telling people of color, African Americans, Latinos, other people, hey, you need to lay down your rights. You need to suffer like Jesus did. You need to not get so liberation focused, because that's not what Jesus did. He died for the cause. So like, you need to be willing to suffer. That can actually be twisted into an oppressive kind of message. So how do we navigate that space?
Well, yeah, and that's happened right throughout history. And what happens in the Gospels is that Jesus is always turning the table on people, right? So just when you feel like, hey, I've risen up, I've accomplished, I've achieved, like God's on my side, however that looks for people, like I'm the beneficiary of privilege, Jesus comes along and says, no, you're not. But then just as soon as the people who have been lifted up get the same sort of haughty spirit, he says, oh, no, you're not. I mean, like some folks are going to be really dissatisfied that Jesus loves the rich man, right?
Yeah.
And some folks are really, really detest that Jesus loves the poor and the oppressed, and that Jesus
gave full wages to the guy that showed up late in the afternoon.
Right. And it's like, this is like, there's a lot of elder brother in most of us, but here's the move that Paul's, I think, trying to make in Philippians 2, is that the argument about whether or not you are privileged is a silly one for Christians, because what Christians should be doing is assuming that they have been blessed and figuring out ways to lay down their blessings for the blessing of other people. Like, this is the equality with God as not something to be grasped, humbled himself. The basic posture of a Christian is humility. And so contrast that with the posture of someone over here says that I'm privileged or I'm blessed in a unique way, that I do not have access to a certain canon of experiences. Why would I, as a person who is laying down, who is not seeking equality with God, who is laying down my life for my brother or sister, why would I, as that person seeking humility, say, no, you're wrong about that? I should assume a posture of humility toward other people. This is why Jesus says, hey, if you are the kind of person who assumes the head of the table at the banquet, you're not my kind of person. Like, take the lowest seat and see if God will lift you up to the place of honor, right? What if that were the model for partisan and political engagement? Like, I'm going to, it's that process that so many people are doing now that I think is really helpful, of choosing to speak last. Like, if you, for whatever reason, perceive that you have the most influence inside a room, inside an organization, like when tough conversations are, speak last. Well, that's not a theory from some university somewhere. Like, Jesus gave us that principle a long time ago. You take the seat of least honor, and then let the host elevate you, instead of assuming that you have something that everybody else ought to honor or to be impressed with, and all of that. So I don't even get that conversation, because it is exactly the opposite. Denying privilege, denying blessing, wanting a seat of honor is the exact opposite position than Jesus and the New Testament teach us to possess in the New Testament.
But there is a way. So I agree with all that in principle, but I got to believe there's a way in which someone like me with white power and privilege could use that as a bludgeon to people of color and say, "Hey, we're all just giving up our rights, so you just need to calm down." Or we all are called to understand our own blessing, and so you shouldn't be calling out my privilege, you know, because that's not what we do as Christians, right? And so that proper doctrine, which I agree with you, can't that be used to abuse and silence people without power, or people
Absolutely.
with less power? Yeah.
And like
So how do we
and it
navigate
has.
that?
Yeah, so here's the thing we just have to deal with in the Christian community, and that we're just not honestly dealing with. Some people in our churches have no interest in being Christian.
All right.
And so here's what I have in 20 plus years of being a pastor at a local church. When you start talking about what it genuinely looks like to be a follower of Jesus, a lot of people are genuinely uninterested. But you have to keep talking about it. And those folks will self-select out of it if the Spirit is not warehoused in their soul. And I think we have to be okay with that. And I have been in more churches where when people come to the reality that they really aren't interested in what Jesus is saying, and that looks like I'm leaving church sometimes, it looks like I'm going to a different church where I'm not confronted as much, we chase after them. And we then amend the system so that they will stay. And what they have learned in time is that I can control a church system with my level of immaturity rather than growing into the maturity. And I think Christian leaders just have to deal with the fact that, hey, man, I'm a preacher's preacher. Like, there's nothing in the world that I like doing more than preaching. And I love a full room. And like, we're going to have to deal with the fact that some of our churches are going to have to get smaller for them to be more Christian.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wrote that down. Some people have no interest in really following Jesus. So I'm going to, when I like republicize this later, I'm going to drop that as a quote. So that's like just a great mic drop. So, and I'm going back to, playing with my gadgets, but Derek says this conversation is great. Dorothy, because I am so insecure, she says, "Thank you, Geoff. I love what Sean was saying, and I had the same question. So she loved the question I asked you. So I'm just going to put that up there too. So thank you, Dorothy, for helping me feel good about myself." And then someone else said, "Preach." I'm pretty sure that was directed toward you, Sean. So there you go. So I thought we were going to go short today, but we're not. We're going to go long. So if you have a couple more minutes, and if all of you listening and watching have a couple more minutes, the last thing that I wanted
to like I said, I'm a preacher. I never go short.
Yeah, right. No, it's okay. You circle the airport 3 times. People think you're coming in. We're going around again.
My wife even has like a sign. She's just like, dude, you're just
land the plane. Yeah. So the last thing, because like the second one is giving up rights, that is kind of like more of the individual perspective. But I think Jesus really does address systematic oppression or systematic violence. And I want to look at the cleansing of the temple. So Jesus goes in Mark 11 is one of the places, it's mentioned multiple times in every, it's one of the only incidents that's mentioned in every, outside the crucifixion and resurrection. It's mentioned in all of the gospels. Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the bench of those selling doves. And we could talk about whether this was a riot or whether this was a protest or whether this was violence or whether this was nonviolence. A lot of people kind of run around trying to designate all those things. But I think however we want to designate it in those terms, what it was is Jesus was addressing systematic abuses. So he wasn't just talking about individual sins, individual redemption, individual confession, and these types of things. So there's 2 things that I think he was addressing. One is that Gentiles were being blocked from accessing the presence of God because they're at the court of the Gentiles, which was as close as they could get. People who were God-fearers, who came from all over the world, the closest they could get was the court of the Gentiles. And then there was the court of the Jews and further in. And so it's pretty certain that the court of the Gentiles is where all this merchandise and money changers was set up. So the people outside of Israel who wanted to worship God were basically being totally hindered because of all the stuff that was going on there. So the prayer, the house of prayer for all nations was not a house of prayer for all nations. So Jesus was saying no to that, to the Gentile exclusion. And he's also saying no to the exploitation of the poor. The money changers and the doves was always the sacrifice that the poorest people would make. And the money changers were really just extensions of kind of the lending and banking system. And people don't really know this, but the temple was the banking system of Israel. That's where all the records were kept. It wasn't just a place of sacrifice and celebration and worship. It was actually where all the records of land, properties, and deeds and debts and things were kept. And so Jesus was saying no to the systematic oppression, financial oppression, as well as kind of the ethnic oppression and exclusion. And so I think for us, and this is again why I say to talk about the politics of Jesus and the way of Jesus, is Jesus deals with systematic issues that aren't just spiritualized issues. He's not dealing just with principalities and slavery to sin and death. He's dealing with human relationships that are not right, that aren't righteous. And so that especially for people kind of from my more evangelical and or white perspective, when people say, well, I don't believe in systematic racism, or we're making too much of these systematic issues and we just need to change hearts and souls and then racism will go away. And I said, well, yeah, we do need to change hearts and souls, but we do need to address systematic issues because that Jesus suggested systematic issues. Thoughts?
Right. Yeah, well,
I'm going fast because I did have 2 cups of coffee, which I said I would not do, but I've had 2 cups of coffee, so I just can't stop.
No, so I'm gonna go very. I cover this in my book, Unarmed Empire. It's a chapter 2 called "The Healing of the Nations," and that ends with talking about the temple changers. So here's what I think is just fascinating about that. Nobody actually disbelieves systematic racism because everybody truly believes in systems and that everything is a system. Like the way your house runs is a system. The way your office runs is a system. The way your computer, everything is a system or it can't run. As soon as you have 2 entities that have to work together in some sort of way, there is a system. Mm-hmm. So if racism exists, then systemic racism exists, right? Like the philosophical framework that says there's no such thing as systemic racism is just actually intellectually untenable unless you believe that racism doesn't exist because everything is inhabited by systems. So, and to describe systemic racism, like you don't have to go very far, right? All you have to have is 2 entities with the same racist intent in them. And then you've got a system, right, that enacts on that. So first of all, I want to start there. Like that really is kind of a silly argument. Secondly, Jesus's response to this sort of systemic abuse of people is like, I find it interesting that this is a moment where Jesus doesn't teach. Like he doesn't gather around the money changers and give them a parable, like as he did so many times. Like there is no sermon in the Gentile court in the Bible. Like he says, this has to be overturned. And I think that's instructive that when we encounter systems are so deeply entrenched, especially long-term systems that have had generational time to build up themselves up. We won't teach ourselves out of those. Like, as I say, oftentimes, like there are some things like I can't preach this into you, that they have to be uprooted and you have to start again, because the problem with systems is the sins become so hidden in a system that you can't know exactly where they are. So you have to start all over. And so people do this in their workplaces all the time when something is not working and they double back and say, what if we started over and designed this in a way that is in a way that is what we would have done from the start if we hadn't inherited this system. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what Jesus is doing. I don't think the money changers is necessarily about riot or violence, but it is it's almost what I would call like performance art theology in a way that, oh, this has to be overturned. We have to start all over because this system is so corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
You respond to that.
Absolutely. Well, I love what you said about the systems being overturned, and they need to be literally overturned. And I always say you very often, or you very seldom think your way into a new way of living. Most of the time you live your way into a new way of thinking. This actually might kind of tease next week's topic about deconstructing our faith and things like that. But for Jesus to do this prophetic action and to engage kind of so viscerally, he's really he's shocking our kind of cognitive narratives. He's trying to get around kind of all of our justifications, and he's just kind of really going at the system. Because systems and structural systems can't be reasoned with, is what you said, and they're very difficult to change that way. And so we need this kind of disruptive. And this is what the moment that we're in right now is very disruptive with COVID and the pandemic, already disrupting all sorts of systems for church, for work, the economy, politics, and now with the death, and not just the death of George Floyd, but I feel like that, along with all the other things, all the other kind of murders of innocent Black people, that this is now another moment. It's kind of a maximal disruptive moment. So how is the church going to move forward? And the reason why I brought up, and I think the riotings are so important, is because I don't want those things to be what distracts us from the larger kind of picture. And but yeah, we just need to keep talking about it. I know a lot of people are really glad we're talking about this. It's like we could probably spend a whole next week talking about similar issues. So yes, thanks everyone for joining. So thank you, Sean. So we have thank you there.
Well, thank you.
And if any of you are around in the morning, please join us live. Please throw in the comments if you're listening live or kind of seeing this later. If you have other thoughts or questions about this, or if you have topics that you wish we would address moving forward, we're hoping to talk about spiritual formation, brain science, prayer. Next week, we're probably going to talk about deconstructing faith and how does faith and doubt and reason, how do people kind of deconvert? What does that look like? There's a lot of headlines around that. I think that's what we decided. Or are you changing your mind, Sean?
Oh, yeah. We're going to talk about Paul Ricoeur, and we're going to talk about this hermeneutics of suspicion.
Oh, good. And he is so committed to this show that we just launched that he's bringing equipment on his family vacation so that we can still keep going. So props to Sean for this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff.
Any last thoughts, Sean?
No, I just, people who want to dialogue can find us through Missio Alliance, through our personal Facebook page. My public Facebook page is Sean Isaac Palmer. Geoff Holsclaw, find us on at Geoff Holsclaw on
at Geoff Holsclaw Twitter. Are you at Sean Palmer or Sean Isaac?
I am at Sean
Twitter?
Palmer. Would you like to plug you and your wife's latest book?
I will next time. We'll do it next time. I have it.
Okay.
Back here. It's inconspicuously put up there, but we're also on YouTube. If you're there on YouTube, you can subscribe. If those are the ways you kind of listen to podcasts and or other shows, but please share this to get the word out. That's like the best way. Put it on your time stream. Say this was helpful, somewhat funny, and mostly helpful, I guess. So we will talk on Monday. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for everyone jumping in. I was very blessed to have people comment. So now I feel really good. I'm gonna ride that high into the weekend. So take it easy, everybody, and we will see you Monday morning. 8:00 a.m. Central, 7. No. See, I say it
8 Eastern, 7 Central.
Thank you. I used to live in Central Time. So see you later, everybody.